It's hard to look at the news these days without seeing a major story on digital economy and specifically the use of data by corporations and government. Just today in the news, right, there's the Elon Musk's $44 billion acquisition of Twitter, taking the company private, an acquisition that I think has as much to do with Twitter's policies regarding data and sharing of content as it does Twitter's financials. Of course, Twitter is a US firm, and so its use of data will be governed by US law. Or will it? I think is the question. Data is easy to move across borders, and the ability of regulators to access and use that data changes dramatically as it moves across borders. So today we're very fortunate to have Aynne Kokas here to discuss her most recent book, Trafficking Data, how China is winning the battle for digital sovereignty, which addresses the problem of data flows across national borders, specifically with regard to China. The book couldn't be more timely, I think, given how much is happening in the area and how important it is to the world economy, but also the world political order. So I'm Tom Nachbar. I'll be the moderator today. I am a professor of law at the law school across the street and affiliated with the National Security Policy Center and here at the Miller Center. I'm also a judge advocate in the U.S. Army Reserve, although I am clearly here today in my professorial capacity, not my military capacity. It's important for me to get that out there. Aynne Kokas is the C.K. Yen professor at the Miller Center and director of UVA's East Asia Center and an associate professor of media studies here at the university. She's written many articles and 2 books, including her most recent book, which we're here to discuss, but also her 2017 book, Hollywood Made in China, which provides some really thought-provoking insights on the role of China in US media. Evan Feigenbaum couldn't be a better expert to discuss this. He's vice president for studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he's responsible for their East and South Asia studies. He's worked in and on the region, both in and out of government, and is the author of several books and articles on the topics of both East and South Asia and technology policy. So we'll start by hearing a bit from Aynne on the topic, followed by a discussion among the panel and some Q&A from the audience. In the second half of the program, we'll be taking from both our in-house questions from both our in-house audience and the online audience. If you're here with us in person, please submit your questions, question cards to our staff in the back. And if you're online, you can submit a question using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. So with that, Aynne, I really enjoyed the book. I learned an awful lot from it. It covers a specific problem of how data is moving across national borders. And in so doing, it really covers the problem from a variety of perspectives. I was wondering if you could help frame the problem for us a little bit and talk about your approach to the problem in the book.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Tom, for being here. And to Evan, you're both experts in this area that I really admire, and I feel very grateful to be here discussing the book with you today. So this is actually a very personal book project for me. I began writing it when I was a Fulbright scholar in 2009, working on my book, Hollywood Made in China. And it started from a very simple problem. I couldn't use the internet when I was working on my PhD dissertation. It kept cutting out. And I fortunately lived across the street from a Canadian-run proxy server company, a virtual private network company that was tunneling through to access the international internet. So I was working on my dissertation about US films in China, and I was struggling with the problem of Netflix and why Netflix couldn't enter the Chinese market, because Disney was able to, but Netflix was having difficulty. And in conversations with my colleagues, it became clear that the issue was not about the content that Netflix was producing, but rather about the data that Netflix was able to gather. So this led me down a really interesting path for research. As a postdoc at Rice University, I started working with a computer security lab and did a deep dive into Chinese digital governance frameworks. In 2010, there was a Chinese government white paper on the internet in China, which established a very wide-reaching vision for internet sovereignty, which included China's domestic landscape, but also, as we later discovered, a kind of more global vision. So fast forward to 2017, we see this moment where the Chinese government implements a data localization law, the cybersecurity law. Now, initially, it was unclear if this applied to Chinese government regulators or to only Chinese firms or to international firms. But then as soon as the law took effect, the Chinese government sued Apple, which then had to move all of its iCloud data into Chinese government-run servers. Now, this set up a really interesting dynamic where we started to see extraterritorial expansion of China's data governance laws. This was escalated through the Hong Kong National Security Law, which included extraterritorial national security enforcement for things like data usage, data production, and for platforms that were operating in Hong Kong and globally. We then moved to the 2021 Data Security Law, which established national security audits for any company that was operating in China or Chinese companies globally, which puts us in this moment right now where we're having this debate about TikTok, the subsidiary of a Chinese firm, ByteDance, and what that actually means for the data that TikTok is able to gather. I'm really excited to talk about that in greater depth, perhaps in the Q&A, perhaps in our conversation here. But one of the things that I really want to emphasize as we're thinking about this conversation is that while China has been establishing these very expansive digital regulations, they're being built on the back of a very extractive system of data regulation that was pioneered in the United States. Those terms of service that we all look at that we can't really understand, where they might be gathering our location data or might be gathering our biometrics, those are the sorts of terms and the sorts of frameworks that the Chinese government is able to leverage in order to use these expansive data security policies and these expansive digital sovereignty policies. Now, I have to tell you, I'm really excited to share this book with all of you. And when I turned it in, I literally got chills. Now, I also tested positive for COVID 5 hours later, so it may have been that. But I look forward to our conversation, and I'm really grateful for all of you for coming out today.
That's great. Thank you. Evan, I wanted to ask you about this. Your work obviously connects very closely to Aynne's, and I'm wondering how you see the connections that Aynne's identified in the book and this issue of data trafficking and digital sovereignty, how it connects to the larger U.S. China relationship.
Sure. First, I want to thank the Miller Center and tell you how great it is to be back in this forum. I haven't been sitting on this stage since before COVID, so it's nice to see actual people in actual chairs. More importantly, I want to thank Aynne and congratulate Aynne. The book is great. I highly recommend it to you. And of course, we're here to celebrate her book, and that's what we're going to have a conversation about. I'm glad you brought up TikTok. If you go on Twitter this morning, that Elon Musk-owned platform, or you follow political debates in Washington, TikTok is very much in the crosshairs, and you've got people in our political class on both sides of the aisle, the Republican side of the aisle and the Democratic side of the aisle, who actually are arguing that the US government and the regulatory architecture ought to ban TikTok wholesale. Why? Because they say TikTok has a Chinese parent, a company called ByteDance, and that gives the company and by extension, they argue the government of China access to Americans' personal data. That then goes to your question because it fits against the backdrop of what I view as an increasingly not just tense U.S.-China relationship, but an increasingly securitized U.S.-China relationship, where nearly every aspect of interaction between Americans and Chinese, including around technology, data flow, co-innovation, things that if you rewind the clock 10, 15 years ago, we thought these were commercial goods. In some cases, we thought they were public goods because data can be used for a lot of public spirited purposes. For instance, pandemic control by tracing how outbreaks move. Or the data you need to do high quality clinical trials for therapeutics or for new drugs. These things were seen as net positives, as public goods. But increasingly, anything that happens between the United States and China, including around data, has been both politicized and securitized because of the strategic rivalry between the United States and China. So this is a relationship. I've been involved with U.S.-China relations for something like 25 years. 10, 15 years ago, it was a broadly cooperative relationship with heavy doses of strategic competition. Now, it is a highly confrontational relationship with what I would call doses of adversarial antagonism. And technology, knowledge, data are very much in the crosshairs of that, in part because all of those things are seen as implicating national security in some way. I think this is especially true of technology. We can come back and talk about data, but by technology, I mean hardware, not just the underlying data within it. And that has a lot to do with changes in the nature of the technology that dominates not just the future of industry or the future of work or the future of service delivery, but frankly, the future of defense, right? From the 1940s to the 1960s, military technology and innovation, things like radar, computing, these things drove a lot of commercial innovation. After the 1960s, because of semiconductors and microelectronics, a lot of commercial innovation drove weapons innovation. The emerging and foundational technologies that are transforming economics and business and industry as you project ahead to the next 10 to 15 years, things like new materials or nanotechnology or artificial intelligence enabled applications or harnessing big data. These things, they do have commercial purposes, but they're all intrinsically dual use. A lot of the same technologies you can use for commercial things, you can use to guide a missile more accurately. And so the default position now of the American political class, the strategic class, of which I'm a card-carrying member because I served in foreign policy positions in government, and frankly, of the regulatory class is, if everything is dual use, then everything is national security. And so the default position is to restrict this. Now, that connects back to what we really should talk about around data in your book, because there is a view in the United States that China represents in this context something very different. There's a China model that's closed, it's statist, it's run by the Communist Party, and they have their reach into everything, technology and data. And then on the other side, there's this putative democratic model. And so the world is shaping up into a battle between team democracy and team autocracy. But in the data area, on a lot of issues related to open data, cross-border data access and transfers, how data is used, there's actually a lot of diversity out there. And many of the world's democracies have rules, regulations, laws, approaches that in some areas resemble the emphases that the government of China has. And in any case, they're not necessarily on the same page as the United States. So data governance is shaping up to be a contested realm where a lot of issues, like whether you put data in the cloud or you localize it, are not just about regime type, but even among democracies, there's a lot of contestation and there's a lot of diversity and fragmentation in the rules and preferences that governments and people have.
And we've seen a lot of responses to what's happening. So both in the US and, as Evan points out, right, in other countries are really responding to this sort of this new data landscape, which includes as a heavy component the idea of data's locale, right, as contributing to data sovereignty. So I was wondering, with regard to China, what do you think? What's that long game for them in terms of the responses that we're seeing, and what are they really hoping to accomplish with regard to moving data into China through data trafficking?
Yeah, I think this is a really important question, and I also want to build on what Evan was talking about this difference between different democracies. I had the opportunity to spend the summer in Japan as an Abe Fellow, and spoke with a lot of people in the foreign policy establishment in Japan. And and it was really fascinating to hear their perspectives on their interest in both Japan or both the United States and in China. So one of the things that was really clear was that people in Japan and Japanese regulators want to be able to have closer alliances with the United States on these issues, but that China remains a very close trade partner, not only a close trade partner, but geographically close from a proximity standpoint. These are very different political systems, but there are economic and security questions that countries like Japan have to balance. And when Evan was talking about other democracies, I think this is really important to look at how the democracies that the U.S. typically allies with on security issues are dealing with these kind of other issues as it relates to trade and investment and national security. Now, with respect to China's long game, I think this is a really interesting question. We see this vision for a massive expansion in China's digital sovereignty or cyber sovereignty. Xi Jinping has outlined a wide range of different visions for this strategically in different speeches. One of them is a community of common destiny, or a community of shared destiny, where countries that are allied to China use similar technology platforms. Another is through the Digital Silk Road trade and investment plans, where like the Belt and Road Initiative, China has invested huge amounts of money and in technology that leads to the establishment of technical pathways that use Chinese technology. Now, the really interesting part about this, and the reason why I think it's important to look at, in some ways, the similarities between China and the United States, is these practices are very similar to things that the US has tried to establish in other technologies, establishing these clear technological pathways that encourage countries to continue using technology because of the technology that was first established for that particular platform. So for example, I'm thinking about things like fintech, where a lot of Chinese Belt and Road Initiative projects rely on payment platforms that are Chinese run. So payment for workers in those projects comes from Chinese fintech platforms. So this is a way in which that trade and investment can establish new pathways for new technologies in the tech sector.
You can see so many opportunities, right, for them to expand that way. I tend to focus on it from a U.S. perspective, both as a matter of responding to policies like this and as a matter of U.S. data protection itself. I guess I'm wondering for both of you, what kind of opportunities are there for a U.S. response? So the Biden administration we've seen, right, has put a lot of emphasis on concern over algorithmic regulation and the export of technology to Chinese, as Evan was talking about. And I think that's crossing over to data. I guess I'm wondering what kinds of tools you see that are available and how successful U.S. regulators and the national security establishment has been in protecting against this.
So I think that there's some low-hanging fruit that we can look at within the U.S. context. One of those is the American Data Privacy and Protection Act, which more than likely with the midterm elections is dead in the water, but it's a national data privacy regulation. And this really underscores a lot of the democratic challenges that Evan was talking about. Not only are there issues within between different democracies, but even within U.S. parties. While there's some agreement across the Democratic and the Republican Party about the fact that data is an issue, particularly, and technology is an issue as it relates to China, within the Democratic Party and within the Republican Party, there are complicated dynamics as it relates to these particular issues. So establishing even a nationwide data privacy regulation that would prevent this data trafficking or this export of data is very, very difficult. Now, one of the things I argue in the book is that the U.S. needs national data privacy regulations. It also needs this, closer alliances with allies and partners, but these are very difficult things to achieve politically. So what I argue is that it's in many ways very similar to a question like climate change, where the solutions that we might suggest, and I'm thinking about the upcoming COP27 conference, the solutions that we might suggest won't resolve the issue, but they might help to mitigate some of the issues. And so I think that's the best that we can really hope for from a U.S. policy response standpoint. But I'm really eager to hear Evan's perspective.
You mean internationally?
Yeah.
I think international data partnerships are really hard.
Yeah.
Are really hard. First, there's no multilateral institution to govern data in the way there is, for instance, for trade, for WTO. And so there's a lot of interest in trying to construct one, but it's hard to construct one among major economies given the diversity of their concerns. And their concerns tend to fall into two broad areas. One is open data, and then the other is cross-border data, data that moves across borders. So the way I see it, there's a lot of diversity around several issues that recur in almost every national context, but where governments have come up with very different solutions. So the first is what I would call, I guess, data reuse. So this is where data is collected for one particular purpose, but then gets used for a different purpose. So I'm trying to think of an example that's neither the US or China. Let's take Taiwan, for example. Taiwan dealt with COVID by, for instance, using data from its national immigration database and its national health insurance database. It combined the data and it used it for contact tracing. So the government would find you based on data that had been collected for one purpose, but it was applying that data for a completely different purpose. So that then raises the second issue, which a lot of people debate, which is consent architectures.
Right.
Because a lot of time when you're asked to share data voluntarily, as you are every day on various web platforms, you share it in one context, but then it will be used in another context by the company. And so this gets at the question, what do consent architectures look like and how do privacy regulators protect you while also facilitating the use and movement of data for commercial purposes? And then third, and this is particularly salient for the China context, is this issue of localization that Tom raised before. Is data stored locally, or does it move across borders? Now, you mentioned the Chinese government wants everything stored on Chinese servers. Well, guess what? Lots of countries want things stored locally on servers. So one example is India, right? India, partly for law enforcement reasons, because Indian law enforcement worries that global companies, the Amazons of the world, that want to store data of Indian customers on global servers, law enforcement will not be able to access that data. There's a bias toward data localization in India. And interestingly, it's not just law enforcement, it's also privacy regulators who are worried about how global companies will use the data of Indian citizens. So these issues around localization and data sovereignty, as I said before, there's not kind of an open model versus a closed model associated with regime type. There's actually a lot more diversity. And that's part of the problem, I think, in trying to come up with data solutions in the multilateral context, is you have to wrestle with that diversity. So here's how that's played out in one example. When you mentioned you were an Abe fellow. So when the late Prime Minister Abe was Prime Minister of Japan, Japan was the chair of the G20. I think this was in 2019. And the G20 meeting was held in Osaka. And Prime Minister Abe had an initiative called the Osaka Track for what he called data free flow with trust. So to promote free flow of data across borders for commercial purposes, but with trusted architectures built into it. So guess who refused to sign up to that initiative? India, Indonesia, Egypt, South Africa. But India is most notable because, to go back to the first question you asked me, if the United States thinks it's in a grand strategic competition with China, and that partners like India are going to be critical to that in India and Japan, well, guess what? In the data governance area, India and Japan were not on the same page. And India was not on the same page as other major democracies. So that's the challenge. I think it's a challenge of diversity, but it's also, there are these challenges of localization, national security, law enforcement, and then just raw protectionism, data protectionism that are built in a lot of countries. And so navigating our way through that diversity in the absence of a multilateral institution is really challenging. So you've got people who are calling, instead of a G20, we should have a D20, the data 20, or maybe it should be a D10, or maybe it should be a D8. Who's in, who's out? We certainly don't want those Chinese rules. So that, I think, is the challenge, is how to build in global governance against the backdrop of diversity, and especially at a time when the major democracies are not really on the same page on some of the critical issues.
So, Evan, your response actually foreshadows or anticipates my next question, which was about potential international solutions. And I mean, your book tends to focus on U.S. responses, right? Understandably. But I was wondering, do you see room for, following up to Evan's response, do you see room for international institutions here?
Yeah, so this becomes a really interesting question. So it depends on what types of international institutions we're talking about. So in the context of something like TPP, the trade agreement that was a follow-on excluding the U.S. from TPP, they are in this really interesting, there are rich data governance regulations that are included in CPTPP, but they're in the interesting environment where both China and Taiwan would like to join CPTPP, and they have to make a decision. And by abdicating participation in TPP, the United States has put itself in an interesting dynamic where the countries that are making those decisions are not necessarily always entirely considering U.S. interests. So I think participation in multilateral organizations becomes important, but we also see things like in the United Nations International ITU, or International Telecommunications Union, China has become increasingly involved in placing former Chinese bureaucrats in really powerful positions that establish standards within that multilateral institution. So part of the really big challenge that I found in a lot of my research was that the U.S. has historically been involved has historically taken a multi-stakeholder approach, meaning that U.S. tech companies and U.S. civil society organizations and the U.S. government have participated in organizations that establish standards that are not necessarily just between states. Now, in contexts like the United Nations, there's strictly a multilateral relationship. So China has outsized influence, and things like the Belt and Road Initiative have helped the Chinese government increase their influence in those fora. The other challenge of the multi-stakeholder context is that US-based tech companies no longer strictly are interested in the US market. There are a lot of global markets out there that have very rich opportunities for the US tech sector. So the US government can't necessarily rely on US tech companies representing the interests of the United States government. And that, I think, is something that our current regulatory framework hasn't fully contended with yet.
So I can't help but pick up on that with regard to the news about Twitter, right? Yeah. So, we've got Elon Musk's acquisition of Twitter, which is now going to be a private, right, non-public company. And I'm wondering how not just, we've talked a lot about large companies, and I'd like you to talk about that as well, but also just individuals. Right. This becomes Elon Musk's tech policy at Twitter. What kind of a role they have in this, and if it's not just among countries like the United States and China.
Yeah,
you should answer it, but I mean, I know you're never supposed to question the premise of the question, but I mean, I wonder if that's the case. I mean, I saw last night his first tweet as the new, what is he calling himself? The chief twit of Twitter. He literally, his thing says chief twit. So his first tweet, the symbol of Twitter is the bird. So he said something, he tweeted something like, the bird is free. And then one of the European regulators tweeted something this morning that said, yeah, the bird's going to have to fly within our cage. So I think he's going to quickly discover, and this is what we've been talking about for the entire panel, is that actually there are a lot of stakeholders in this, and there's a lot of diversity in rules. And guess what? There's no set of global rules. And so he's going to have to play by the regulatory regimes that exist around the world. So he's going to bump up against European regulators in the first instance. Who, I mean, like the first 9 things I saw in my Twitter this morning said, Trump won, ivermectin works, climate change is a hoax. It was literally in one tweet. So people are testing, and then they said, testing out the platform. So they're trying out to see what the content moderation is going to look like. But I think what he's going to find is that there are a lot of governments around the world who may have a different interpretation than he does. And they've enshrined it in law, in regulation, and they have tools of administrative fiat that are designed to mitigate what they view as the effects of some of that. So I don't know. I don't know what that means for one individual, because he's not an individual. He's an individual as a company privately. But then second, companies have to operate, as you were implying when you talked about standards, and within the rules that are established. And what we've discovered is that companies can operate under all kinds of rules. The answer on the CPTPP from the US was always, well, yeah, we're out, but look how US business dwarfs Chinese business in Asia. Great. But US business has been operating in China according to Chinese rules. We've discovered that German business was operating in Russia according to Russian rules. So businesses operate according to rules. And if rules are diverse, then I presume that Twitter, this is not my area of expertise, but I presume that Twitter is going to have to adjust to the rule set in the context in which they operate. And since I'm a China specialist, the China piece of that will be interesting. I mean, the platform is banned in China, but he has big ambitions in terms of his own commercial interests in China. And so how that plays out is going to be quite interesting to watch.
And I think looking at Evan's point, I think that looking at the European case is a really interesting counterpoint to the US case, because as we've seen in the Musk acquisition of Twitter, there have been many iterative efforts to regulate and to sue Musk for dirty dealing, which have resulted in his successful acquisition of this major platform in the United States with very limited oversight over how he runs that algorithm. So I think while we may see that this is an opportunity to test the strength of European regulations, it's also an opportunity to see the weaknesses of US regulations in this area.
Well, and I take one of the points of your book to be that the two worlds don't exist separately.
Right.
And I mean that in a couple of different ways. And I think Musk is a great example of this. So US companies do not exist in a world that's separate from US regulation, right? They affect each other. So a lot of US regulation is designed to assist US companies in
Yeah.
ways that actually might enable some of the
Right.
behavior that you're seeing in the book, because, right, it's good for business, and there are other aspects of it that are good for business. And then similarly, Musk has Twitter, but he also has a lot of other commercial interests in China, right?
Tesla.
He is the
Twitter's banned in China. Tesla's not
Right.
banned in China. And so,
he is the intersection of a really complex set of commercial interests in China that at least arguably changes incentives with regard to China. So I guess I'm wondering, can we really look at regulation as being static with regard to the companies, or are these two worlds that affect each other in ways that at least enable the kind of data movement that you talk about in the book?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think in the case of TikTok, we saw that, while there was actually a, reasonable amount of symmetry across different political parties about the security challenge that TikTok presents, we also see a dynamic where the people who were protesting, for example, the Trump TikTok ban, were influencers in the US and advertisers. And now, even in the Biden administration, I just saw something yesterday that the Biden administration was welcoming TikTok influencers who had a total of 58 million followers to come to the White House so that he could share some of his messages. I mean, so we have these really complicated dynamics where these private platforms or private sector platforms are also really integral to the US economy and our communication system. And so how that works becomes really complicated. Now, in the case of Europe, in talking with European interlocutors when writing this book, one of the things that they noted was Europe is in a comparatively free position because they don't have so many large tech companies that are engines of the European economy, so that it's easier, frankly, to regulate from an economic and a political standpoint.
So the book talks a lot about moving data across borders, right, and specifically across borders into China. But I'm wondering about China, about what's happening inside China itself, and whether the absolute size of the Chinese economy is such that they can get a lot of the benefits of what they're trying to do just with data in China, or if moving data back and forth is really a critical part of it, and how that extends to the US-Chinese security relationship.
Yeah, so I think this is a really important question. So definitely the Chinese government can get a huge amount of benefit from domestic economies of scale. And we've seen this play out with the development of companies like WeChat, with the development of ByteDance and the Douyin platform that was able to grow, and then eventually ByteDance was able to purchase Musical.ly, which then became TikTok. So the development of domestic innovation through the Chinese market is really important. And then within the context of COVID, we also see this, the use of Chinese tech platforms as a way to monitor the population through things like health codes, the development of municipal governance systems, both private sector and public sector, that are based on relatively flexible dynamics for government access to user data, that a lot of countries are frankly very interested in, because these are helpful tools for governance, particularly in societies where there isn't a lot of individual user data protection.
Can I just, what's to me at least, I mean, I'm curious what you think of this. I'm going to try out an argument. I think what's unique about China domestically is also what creates problems for China internationally. So what's unique about China domestically is the way in which data from people's online lives can be married up to data from their offline lives to give companies, and by extension, the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party, enormous visibility into all aspects of people's existence. So what do I mean by that? There's a lot about here in the United States about my online life or your online life that companies know, right? Facebook knows, I'm on Facebook. Facebook knows a lot about me, right? So it knows I like the Chicago Cubs. It knows because I post pictures from Washington last week that I was in Washington. I was in Hawaii a couple of weeks ago to do something with the Indo-Pacific Command. I put up pictures of Diamond Head and Waikiki. So Facebook knows I was in Hawaii. So it knows stuff like that. But when I get my hair cut or I do my grocery shopping, I pay for it with a credit card. And so there's transaction data that the credit card company has, but it's not integrated with my mobile device or anything like that. In China, because mobile payment is so pervasive and so many aspects of your life are integrated within a single app, like like WeChat. Yeah, like WeChat. Basically, companies and then the regulators and the government have an enormously robust and multidimensional picture of your entire life. They know everything about you, and that data can be harnessed in all sorts of ways. And I think that's what scares people about China. But it's also, it's a huge advantage for Chinese companies because it gives them a very robust set of data. But because it scares people, that is precisely the advantage that creates problems for China internationally. They have, somebody used the word scale. They got 1.4 billion people. They have huge scale. They have a lot of data. But what they don't have is trust. And remember when I talked about Prime Minister Abe's initiatives, free flow of data with trust, where this question around consent architectures, consent's all about trust. How are people, or reuse. I gave them consent for this, but they're using the data. So trust is a variable that matters a lot in the way people and companies and governments look at the usage of data. And I think that's the core of the problem with China, including for multinational companies, is they have scale, but nobody trusts them in some ways. And so if you think of industries where China's been trying to develop a comparative advantage, for instance, let's take life sciences, biotech, development of new drugs and therapeutics. To do a clinical trial, you need a lot of data. China's got scale. They got 1.4 billion people. They can do a lot of data. China has something like 25, 26% of global cancer cases. Not surprisingly, Chinese life sciences companies are developing and pioneering cancer drugs. You may have read in the newspaper, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration has rejected a couple of Chinese drugs because they didn't like the way the trials were conducted. In other words, scale, no trust. So if you think about that, both in commercial terms, but also in terms of designing global cooperative regimes, we all have an interest in developing new drugs and therapeutics. The reality is some of the things that work for China domestically create mistrust internationally. And actually that gives other countries, including small countries without scale, the opportunity to leverage trust as their comparative advantage. So I read a report on Taiwan and the life sciences last year. This was a point we made, they have 23, 24 million people. So not a lot of scale compared to 1.4 billion, but they do have trust. So if you trust, you can compensate for lack of scale in ways that merely having scale when nobody trusts your data, that creates a problem. So what people want to see, companies, individuals, is high quality, open data, not closed data, high quality, or open data that's low quality. And so it presents this very interesting picture because it has a lot of inherent advantages, and the way they collect data enables the surveillance regime, but it's also a big advantage for companies, but there's no trust in it internationally. And even I think for Chinese citizens, there are question marks around that.
So I have, building on that a little bit, I think, one of the challenges that you identify in the book to U.S. regulation is that U.S. regulation is, the regulators are disintegrated, right? There are a number of federal regulators, there are the states, right? A lot of whom have their own data regulation and attempts to address these problems. Are there ways in which that sort of more disintegrated approach, which makes it a little harder to advance regulation, might be advantageous in other ways, in some of the ways that Evan was talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a reason why this system exists, right? It didn't just develop spontaneously. Having different state laboratories and different ways to test out regulation is a way that we can test out how different companies can function within these systems. And also, it's a way to protect industrial growth. So the way that a lot of these companies have been able to flourish in the United States has been because they can extract large amounts of data that they then monetize, that then the United States government and U.S. stockholders and U.S. capital markets benefit from as they, get double-digit returns from their tech stocks. So this is very wealth enabling, and it's really important for the growth of the U.S. economy. It's also been, these robust companies have also been engines of U.S. growth internationally. A lot of the policies that India has developed are in response to these U.S. tech firms that are extracting massive amounts of data, but they also gained a lot of financial benefit from that practice. Now, I think that what we can see within the U.S. context is that there are benefits to looking at specific smaller scale types of regulation. So in the context of New York, we see specific financial regulations. In the context of Illinois, we see specific biometric regulations. I think the bigger challenge that the U.S. faces is that there isn't right now a single coordinating body that addresses a lot of these issues. The other challenge that the US faces is that talking about questions of trust. Americans are very skeptical of any kind of government oversight of data, of their user data, and are much more comfortable sharing that data with corporations. And I teach a class called Data Ethics of TikTok here at UVA. And it's really interesting to hear the students talk about their experiences of sharing data with companies versus sharing it with the US government. And there's a very long tradition in the United States of being resistant to heavy government oversight. So it's understandable, but this gives countries like China a huge advantage when trying to develop national policies. And just to build on Evan's point, just to kind of give you a sense of how tightly connected online and offline life is, in order to get a new cell phone in China, you have to share your biometrics, so your face, your fingerprints, and then share your number with the state-run government telecom agency, which then links to your WeChat, which is then the platform that you use to pay for almost everything and then document your travel. This is a level of data integration that's almost unthinkable within a US context. So yeah, it's a little bit easier to, and of course there's the problem of China, or there's the Chinese government data oversight through Chinese government run servers. So yeah, it's easier in that sense for the Chinese government to control and look at user data because these systems are in place, systems that are almost impossible to imagine in a US context.
Can I say that the world looks different outside the United States, in part because the problem set around the world is a little different than it is in the United States. So I think a lot of Americans has this idea that sharing data is pernicious or evil. People take advantage of your data. Biometrics. Oh, I don't know how I feel about biometrics, but I mean, that stuff can be really empowering and revolutionary in other contexts. And I'll give you an example. Let's go back to India as an example. India has a huge informal, unorganized economy with people who are outside the formal economy. And therefore, they didn't have bank accounts. They were outside the organized financial system. So India they pioneered a set of technologies they call India Stack. And the stack is based on a personal biometric identification system called Aadhaar that basically enabled them to take hundreds of millions of people who were outside the organized financial system. And because they had a personal identifier, and they had a mobile phone, because mobile phones are very deeply penetrative across the Indian population, including people who are outside the organized economy. It enabled them to bring people into the formal financial system who would have been unbanked. So now, if you extrapolate to other areas of the world, you look at the Middle East or North Africa, the World Bank's done a lot of work on this. There are huge numbers of people who are outside the organized financial system. So this problem of financial inclusion is one that Americans can't relate to, but is a big problem all over the world. And in the Middle East and North Africa, particularly women are unbanked. So bringing people into the organized financial systems for financial inclusion, that is a big challenge across the global South. Does the United States have the model for that? Do European economies have the model for that? Not really. India has a model for that actually can be exported and scaled around the world, because the way they've combined technology with the technology of phones, with identifiers to bring people into the organized economy and into the financial system, that's enormously empowering for people who are outside the organized economy, and particularly of women who are unbanked around the world. So, I work on China, but I work on India too. People often talk about India. There's this cliche that India is this place that needs to be reformed, rather than a generator of reform ideas that can be exported to other parts of the world. But in this area, because of Aadhaar, because of India Stack, because the big ideas for the developing world, actually, I think are going to come from places like India. They're not going to come from China. They're not going to come from the US or Europe necessarily. And so this stuff, I think it's outside the way some Americans think about it, but can be this problem of how to leverage data for other sets of economic challenges. It can be enormously empowering too.
Yeah, it's difficult though, right? Because so many of the systems, right, in countries like the United States grew up in a world, without that kind of data, where it was disintegrated, right? So the regulatory regimes grew up without it. And so we're seeing a lot of regulatory challenges. We have sort of one picture from China, we have another picture from India. it'll be interesting to see how other countries who are looking at this kind of integration, how they respond from a regulatory perspective.
And another picture from Korea and another picture from India. So that's right. So this area, it's really fragmented. But if you want to run a global economy off it, where cross-border data access and transfers matter, then you have to find some ways to coordinate these. But I think what we're trying to get at, there's actually a lot more complexity than just a Chinese way and a non-Chinese way. And I mean, we're Americans, so we tend to think in binaries, but the world is definitely not binary.
Definitely.
So I did want to take questions from the audience, both the local audience and the remote audience. And the first one is for Evan, asking Evan to talk a little bit about the recent Chinese Party Congress and what it tells us about U.S. China relations in this space.
Okay, we're off the topic of your book. Do you want?
Oh, no, this is.
Want me to
everything.
address
Yeah,
this?
no,
Okay.
absolutely.
The recent Party Congress. So, well, let me do this in a couple bites. Xi Jinping, the leader of China, is going to be with us for some time. He's going to serve as the leader of China for another 5 years, and possibly, and I would even say probably beyond that. He's often compared to the two individuals who also were paramount leaders of China, Chairman Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping. And you often see this in newspapers or in media stories. They'll say he's the new Mao. The New York Times had a piece a couple of weeks ago. They said he's the second coming of Mao Zedong. He's not Mao. Mao was a chaos politician who liked to destroy things. He destroyed institutions. He destroyed the Communist Party. That's what the Cultural Revolution was. He was constantly purging people. That's not Xi Jinping. This is a man who's trying to build a disciplined, one-party state in which the party penetrates into all aspects of society. That's not Mao. But he's not Deng either, because the way we've thought about Chinese politics, and if you teach Chinese politics here, but the way we've thought about Chinese politics for the last several decades, it's really been a function of Deng Xiaoping's legacy. And that was based on a collective leadership, a balance among these putative factions in the Communist Party, and certain norms, like when you hit 68 years old, you would retire out of the system. And so the first headline out of this party Congress is that all those things went out the window. There's no collective leadership in the sense we meant it before. There's one guy who is large and basically in charge. There are no factions in the party in the way we thought about factions before. And the retirement norms really went out the window. There were people who were 67 who should have not been retired. They were forcibly retired. There's one person who's 69 who made the Politburo. Vice chairman of the Central Military Commission, the apex military body, he's 72. So all of those norms are basically gone. And if all those norms are gone, what are you left with? Xi Jinping is the core. So that's an important headline, because the paradigm we have for thinking about Chinese politics really has to change, and it has to focus much more on one individual and less on a collective. So that's the personal side. And then I say, then there's just the policy side. And that paradigm needs to change too, because I think if you read about Xi Jinping in the papers, he's often a cartoon, he's a caricature. He's a communist, he's a statist, he's an aggressive, and there's truth to that. But he has, in my view, if we take him seriously, a theory of what the problems are in China, and also a theory of governance. And at its most basic, the theory of the problem is that there was a social contract in China, which is, I'm going to simplify this, but basically, you all stay out of organized politics, leave that to the Communist Party, and you'll have opportunities for material gain that your parents and grandparents didn't have, which was great right up until 450 million, 500 million people achieved many material things. And then their expectations and demands began to transcend things that were merely material. They wanted equity of opportunity for their children. They wanted equality of life chances. They wanted air that they could breathe, food that was safe to eat, water that they could drink. And so his emphasis, because those were the things, particularly among urban middle-class people in China, that threaten the Communist Party's legitimacy, has been to emphasize not growth for growth's sake, but equity, welfare gains. He's a populist. At the same time, he's a communist, and he's a disciplinarian. So his agendas are party discipline on the one hand, but social equity on the other. And I think that's not often taken seriously. So he calls that agenda common prosperity. And it's often interpreted in different ways. It doesn't mean redistribution to me in the sense of trying to make rich people poor. But the way the pie is going to get shared in China is going to be very different under this guy than it was before, where some people were going to get rich first. Mm-hmm. And if you take him seriously that way, that's basically what came out of the Congress. There's one guy in charge, and he's got this vision. And it's not this kind of growth-centric, market-centric agenda that we've seen in China. So where that lands, is that going to work out for him? You know, I'm American. So I'm kind of ideologically committed to the idea this is going to work out for them. But, maybe it will, maybe it won't. It's going to get a market test in the next few years.
So a question from the webinar about age tech, about data specifically related to aging and older Americans, about how U.S. age tech data and germ technology will be protected or could be protected.
Yeah, this is, I have a chapter in the book actually that talks about health data and health tech. And I think this is a really fascinating area in US regulations where we have HIPAA, which protects health data. But the challenge with HIPAA is that we're in this moment where the health data, which was primarily data from visits to physicians, has transformed and become much more expansive. So now it includes things like the data that your CPAP machine gathers, or the data that might be gathered by your smartwatch, or the data that might be gathering by different tools of aging. These are technologies where the consent, talking about consent architecture, first of all, most people who are using these technologies are not even aware that they're consenting to anything by using the technology, let alone having very clear terms of service that are available to read or to understand. Also, there's a misunderstanding in a lot of sectors that this type of data is covered by HIPAA, which it is not. So this is commercial data that a lot of companies are able to gather and aggregate on the plus side to develop more sophisticated technologies to enhance aging tech. So this is the double-edged sword. The more data that's gathered, a lot of times the more sophisticated the tools are. It's really nice when there's a company that offers a great algorithm that gives you a great recommendation or a more sophisticated product. But that also means that that our health data privacy is really under attack in those areas. So it'll be really interesting to see what HIPAA reform looks like over the next few years, and particularly if it's covered by any comprehensive data privacy legislation in the United States. But this is also an area of a lot of economic growth, and there's not a lot of incentive from a financial standpoint to pressure for enhanced oversight of our health data.
So there's another question about Elon Musk, about X, right? His goal is X, right? An app that is an everything app, right? And acquiring Twitter is a step in that direction. And the suggestion that X is what China has already, and sort of a question about whether Musk can pull this kind of thing off in the West, whether that kind of consolidation in one app is even really feasible in countries like the United States or in Europe.
The American wants that. Well, he's pretty explicit. I mean, you should think that he's pretty explicit about what he's trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting question, because on one hand we see this effort, which would clearly, and I mean, Tom, you do work in the antitrust area. I mean, I would be interested to hear your perspective on, what mechanisms there might be in place to push back against this. And we've seen in a lot of cases, not a lot of success in efforts to push back against tech companies that are kind of in pretty clear, my understanding, and pretty clear violation of U.S. antitrust law. But I mean, I'd be interested in your perspective on this. But when in the context of Musk, I think it'll be a really interesting test case to see how much he can acquire and how much he can integrate. I think it's less of an issue about user interest, because we have seen an increasing interest in these kind of integrated app platforms. So the proliferation of things like Apple Pay, of using Google or using Amazon to sign into different apps. So I think that from a technological standpoint or from a user standpoint, there is a movement toward greater cross integration of different types of apps, including payment, social, different types of content consumption. And companies like Disney and Amazon and Google have all been moving in those directions. So I think it's not unthinkable that there would be a market for that. The big question from my standpoint, and I'd love for you to weigh in on this, Tom, is whether or not there's a regulatory infrastructure in the US that would support such a thing. And
Right. So anyone who talks to me about will hear that I think antitrust is everything, right? And
Yeah.
so as you're talking about these questions of integration, antitrust struggles with this,
Right.
and it's a real problem for U.S. competition regulators to, antitrust feels very differently about conduct or mergers between competitors as opposed to firms that don't compete. And a lot of these tools of integration, right, combining your mobile phone with payment, well, mobile phones and payments don't necessarily compete
interesting.
Until afterwards, and then all of a sudden they do. and we saw this with the Facebook acquisition of WhatsApp, right? That was viewed differently by the FTC several years ago when it happened than it is now. So I think these problems of integration are real problems for U.S. competition policy. It's really hard for regulators to figure out what to do about it. And we're involved in a very big conversation about it because there's a potentially huge upside to integrating these capabilities. And then there's also a potentially huge downside, which is that you could wind up with one firm that controls everything. So I think it's a problem a problem that you're talking about a lot about in the public sector is a problem in the private sector as well. And then how to address it. And one of the things I really love about the book is that you do handle that overlap between commercial regulation and national and what has traditionally been viewed as more of a national security problem. And I think the book recognizes that those two things are not separate. I think that's an important step forward and one that we're really facing more and more.
Thank you.
So I did want to start wrapping things up by asking for closing thoughts from the two of you. I will say that my own closing thought after reading the book is just how much harder it is for liberal democracies to develop coherent approaches to this problem than it is for countries like China, right, that are more centralized in their approach and according to Evan, are becoming even more centralized in their approach. And I do think it's hard to know whether this is a bug or a feature, right, that to some extent, as you mentioned, right, the different approaches, they can be laboratories, or they can be opportunities for firms to exist in sort of one state regulatory regime and say, does that work well from a regulatory standpoint and a financial standpoint? But also it does make it really hard for us to come up with a single approach as opposed to countries like China. So just other closing thoughts that you have before we wrap up.
Well, first of all, I want to be sure to thank the Miller Center for hosting this event and also for supporting the work of this book. It wouldn't have happened without this amazing community. So that's my major final takeaway. But I want to also thank Tom and Evan for this really rich conversation. For the audience and for the people watching, my main piece of advice, my main piece of feedback is to take these issues seriously. And even if you're not an avid tech user, there are people in your lives whose data, who might be sharing or gathering data about you in ways that you may not fully understand or fully appreciate. So these are things that are everyone's responsibility to address. And we have and I would urge everyone to really be aware of what policies your elected representatives are taking as it relates to these issues.
Well, my closing thought is to tell you to read the book because we're here to celebrate the book, but more, I mean, like a lot of Anne's work, I mean, your work on Hollywood too, it's really unique. And she has a talent for spotting emerging areas, I think, that are becoming much more central to multiple conversations. In this case, the conversation about data governance, conversation about China, conversation about U.S. China, and then a conversation about what China's doing in the world. And I mean, let's face it, China's got a $15 trillion economy. It's the world's second largest economy. They got a lot of big tech companies. They're Chinese companies, but increasingly they're operating globally. And actually there's a lot of demand side pull, particularly in the global South, for what China's offering. And that is anathema to a lot of people here in the United States, and not surprisingly so. So that being the case, the topic is more important than ever. And I haven't really seen a treatment of it that has the depth or range that this one does. And that's typical of all of Anne's work. So I'm really glad you invited me here to do this, because you could have had anybody come down and talk about it, but you asked me. So thank you to the Miller Center, but thank you especially to Tom, but especially to you, and go buy the book. It's really good.
Agree. It's a fantastic book. So I just got a huge amount out of it. I really appreciate it. I want to thank Evan and Anne as well, and the audience for attending, and the Miller Center for putting this on and inviting me to moderate. It's as other programs here, it's just a great opportunity to get deep into an issue that one couldn't get into in another forum. And so thank you so much. And with that, I think wrap up.
Thank you.